If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land.
Powerful words, aren't they?
Absolutely. Welcome back to By the Pages. You know, the podcast that takes us all on these deep dives into fascinating books. We're so glad you're back with us for another one.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to really dig in and kind of uncover those hidden depths of these amazing texts.
And, you know, today we are diving into 1 and 2 Chronicles. Now, I know some of you out there might be thinking, 2 books in 1 episode. That's a lot to unpack.
It is a lot.
It is, but here's the thing. They were originally 1 book, just later split for practical reasons.
Yes, scrolling.
Scroll length.
Right.
Back then wasn't exactly unlimited.
No, not at all. And you know what's really interesting about Chronicles is where it kind of sits in the Hebrew Bible. Like, it comes last. It acts as this grand finale.
Like a summary?
A summary, the whole sweep of the Jewish scriptures.
Starts with Adam.
The very first human.
And ends with the return from exile.
It neatly bookends the entire story.
Yeah.
It's like the author wanted to remind everyone of the whole story before they move on to something new.
But let's back up a bit. We know that Chronicles was likely written after the Babylonian exile, sometime in the 5th or 4th century BCE. Could you set the scene for us? What was going on at that time?
Okay, so imagine the disappointment. The Israelites had returned to Jerusalem, but things weren't quite what they'd hoped for. You know, that glorious restoration they envisioned.
Yeah.
With a new temple, a powerful king hadn't materialized. They were rebuilding, but under the watchful eye of a foreign power.
Mm-hmm.
There was this sense of disillusionment, a longing for something more.
So looking back at their past, at the glory days of David and Solomon, to find hope for their present.
Exactly. And the author uses those stories, those larger-than-life figures, to offer this glimmer of hope.
Okay.
In a really difficult time. It's this message of remember who you are, remember what God has done, don't lose hope.
Don't lose hope. But those first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles, all those genealogies, those endless lists of names, I'm not going to lie, I kind of skimmed those parts. Do those names really matter that much?
They do. They actually do. Remember, Chronicles is like a highlight reel of the entire Old Testament. And the genealogies are the author's way of kind of summarizing that whole story. He's hitting on those key figures, reminding us of the lineage of David.
Okay.
The great king and Aaron, the first high priest. These genealogies aren't just some random lists of names. They're laying the groundwork for those major themes of Chronicles.
Yes, sir.
Messianic hope and the significance of the temple.
Okay, so there's more to those genealogies than meets the eye.
Absolutely.
But then we move on to the stories of David, which feel familiar from Samuel, but different somehow.
Yes.
It's like watching a movie adaptation of a book that you love. The basic plot is there, but some of the details are changed.
That's a great way to put it. You'll notice that First Chronicles skips over some of those less flattering episodes in David's life. The Bathsheba scandal, the conflict with Saul. Those stories are absent. It's a very polished, almost idealized version of David.
Okay, so couldn't someone argue that omitting David's flaws actually weakens the message of hope? Doesn't it make the Messiah seem less relatable?
That's an interesting point. I think the author's trying to do something different here. He's not trying to erase David's flaws.
Yeah.
He's painting a picture of this ideal king.
Right.
This kind of messianic prophecy. Remember those prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel who talked about a new David who would come and restore Israel?
Yeah.
It's that same idea. The author is using David's story not as a literal biography, but as a blueprint for future hope.
So 1 Chronicles is setting the stage for a future Messiah who embodies all the qualities of this idealized David.
Exactly.
A king who will be both powerful and righteous, who will unite the people and restore their fortunes.
Precisely.
And this is where that covenant of promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17 becomes really significant.
Yeah.
If you compare it to the same promise in 2 Samuel 7, you'll notice some subtle but important differences. Chronicles really emphasizes the conditional nature of the covenant. God's promise to David and his descendants is really contingent on their faithfulness to that covenant. It's a reminder that even kings are accountable to God.
Yeah.
And their actions have consequences.
Absolutely. It sets a higher standard for the Davidic line and ultimately prepares the reader for the coming Messiah.
So it's not a blank check. It's a conditional promise.
Yeah.
It changes things.
It does.
The author is reframing these Davidic stories as glimpses into this future kingdom ruled by a Messiah who's yet to come. A kingdom characterized by justice, righteousness, and God's blessing. It's a powerful message of hope for a people struggling in exile, isn't it?
It is, and that hope is further developed as we transition into 2 Chronicles. The focus narrows even further, zeroing in on those kings of Judah, the direct descendants of David. The northern kings are completely left out.
Right.
It's all about highlighting the Davidic line, tracing the lineage that will ultimately lead to the Messiah.
Okay, and the author seems really interested in whether these kings were obedient or disobedient to God and the Torah. It's almost like a scorecard for good kings and bad kings, with their actions having direct consequences for the nation.
That's a great way to put it. Their obedience or disobedience has a direct impact on the nation. When they follow God, the nation prospers. When they turn away, judgment follows. It's a clear cause and effect relationship.
Okay, so here's something I find really intriguing. The way 2 Chronicles ends, it's so abrupt. We get to Cyrus allowing the Israelites to return from exile.
Right.
But then the sentence just stops, unfinished.
It's almost as if the author is inviting us to finish the story ourselves.
What do you mean?
Well, the author knew that the Israelites did return to Jerusalem, but it seems like he considered this return incomplete. It lacked the Messianic king, the glorious temple, the full restoration they'd longed for. The unfinished sentence is a reminder that true restoration is still ahead, tied to the arrival of the Messiah.
So the Old Testament, at least in the traditional Jewish order, concludes with this story in search of an ending. The return from exile is just the beginning. We're left waiting for the Messiah to come and make things right, to fulfill the promises made to David and his descendants.
It's a brilliant literary technique, wouldn't you say? Leaving the reader on a cliffhanger, longing for more, anticipating the next chapter in the story.
Absolutely. I love how 1 and 2 Chronicles weave history and prophecy together, using the past to point toward this incredible hope for the future.
It's a reminder that even in times of disappointment and uncertainty, there's always reason to hope, and that hope is rooted in the promises of God. It's really remarkable how the author uses the past to point toward the future, shaping that narrative to highlight this incredible hope for a coming Messiah.
We were just talking about how 2 Chronicles focuses specifically on the kings of Judah, those in the direct line of David. Almost as if the author is presenting a kind of case study in leadership, showing how those kings either lived up to or fell short of that covenant ideal.
Yes. And their actions have a direct impact on the nation. Remember, in Chronicles, the well-being of the people is tied to the faithfulness of their leaders.
Right.
When the kings honor the covenant, the people prosper. When they turn away from God, disaster follows.
It makes me wonder about the role of the everyday people. Where do they fit into this narrative? Are they simply passive recipients of their leaders' choices, or do they have agency as well?
That's a great question. While Chronicles does focus on the kings, it also highlights that crucial role of the priests and the Levites, those folks responsible for the religious life of the nation. They play a vital part in maintaining that covenant relationship with God, instructing the people in the law, and leading them in worship.
So it's not just about individual piety. It's about a communal commitment to God, a shared responsibility for upholding the covenant.
Precisely, Chronicles reminds us that faith isn't just a private matter. It has this communal dimension. The well-being of the community is bound up with the faithfulness of its members, both leaders and ordinary people.
This reminds me of something we touched on earlier, how Chronicles, despite being written centuries ago, still has something to teach us today.
Right.
This idea of communal responsibility of our actions, having consequences not just for ourselves, but for those around us, it feels very relevant, especially in our interconnected world.
Absolutely. We often think of leadership in terms of individuals, those in positions of power.
Right.
But Chronicles suggests a more expansive view of leadership, one that encompasses everyone who has a role to play in shaping the community.
Yep.
It challenges us to think about our own sphere of influence, however small it may seem, and to consider how our choices contribute to the well-being or the detriment of those around us.
It's like we're all part of this larger narrative, this unfolding story. And our actions, our choices, however small they may seem, contribute to the direction of that story.
That's a powerful way to put it. And Chronicles reminds us that the direction of that story, whether it leads towards blessing or judgment, is largely determined by the choices we make, both individually and collectively.
It's a sobering thought, but also a hopeful one.
Yeah.
If our choices matter, then we have the power to shape the future, to move toward a more just and compassionate world. It's not just about passively waiting for a Messiah to come and fix everything.
Right?
We have a role to play.
Exactly. Chronicles doesn't present a passive view of hope. It's not about sitting back and waiting for God to do everything. It's about actively participating in the unfolding of God's purposes, about aligning our choices with the covenant ideal, about striving to live lives of faithfulness and obedience, even in the midst of difficulty.
It makes me think about how we often focus on the grand sweep of history, the big events, the major players. But Chronicles reminds us that history is made up of countless individual stories, each one contributing to the larger tapestry.
And each one reflecting the same fundamental truths about human nature, about the consequences of our choices, about the possibility of redemption and restoration.
You know, it's fascinating to think about the fact that Chronicles, despite being a historical narrative, a retelling of events that happened centuries before the author's time, is also deeply theological.
Yes. The author isn't just recounting events, he's interpreting them, shaping them to convey a particular message about God, about the covenant, about the nature of faithfulness and obedience.
And about the hope for a future where those ideals are fully realized.
Precisely. It's a hope that sustains the people in exile. A hope that points them toward a future where God's promises are fulfilled, where the Davidic king returns, where the temple is rebuilt, where the nation is restored to its former glory.
Speaking of the temple, we haven't really talked about its significance in Chronicles. It seems to play a much larger role here than in the earlier historical books.
You're right. The temple isn't just a building in Chronicles. It's the symbolic center of the nation, the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells among his people.
So the focus on the temple in Chronicles is really about the presence of God, about God's dwelling among his people.
Exactly. And this ties back to the theme of exile. The Babylonian exile wasn't just a physical displacement, it was a spiritual crisis. The destruction of the temple, the loss of their homeland, raised these profound questions about God's presence, about his faithfulness to the covenant.
And Chronicles is offering an answer to those questions.
Yes. The author is reassuring his readers that God hasn't abandoned them. He's still present, even in exile. And he will restore them, he will bring them back to their land, he will rebuild the temple, he will fulfill his promises.
So the temple becomes a symbol of hope, a promise of future restoration.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, God's presence remains. And that presence is the source of true hope, the foundation for a future where brokenness is healed, where wrongs are righted, where God's reign of justice and peace is fully established.
Okay, so we've talked about the kings, the people, the temple. But what about the actual content of these books? There are a lot of stories in Chronicles, some familiar, some less so. How do those stories contribute to the overall message of the books?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that makes Chronicles so fascinating is the way the author retells those familiar stories from Samuel and Kings, often with subtle but significant changes.
You mentioned this earlier about the author leaving out some of the less flattering episodes in David's life. But what about the stories that are included? How are they shaped to fit the overall purpose of Chronicles?
Well, for example, the story of David's sin with Bathsheba is omitted, but the account of his bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem is greatly expanded.
Sure.
The author highlights David's meticulous preparations for the Ark's arrival, his careful adherence to the law, his heartfelt worship and thanksgiving.
What's the significance of that?
It reinforces the importance of proper worship, of obedience to the law, of reverence for the things of God. It also sets a precedent for the future temple, portraying David as the ideal model for temple worship and administration.
It's like the author is using David's example to instruct his own audience on how to approach God, how to worship him, how to live lives that are pleasing to him.
Exactly. And this emphasis on proper worship, on meticulous adherence to the law, is a recurring theme throughout Chronicles. It's a message that resonates with that post-exilic community who are rebuilding their lives, their community, their relationship with God.
And it's a message that continues to resonate with us today, reminding us that faith isn't just about believing the right things.
Right.
It's about living them out, about aligning our lives with God's will, about embodying the values of his kingdom.
Absolutely. Chronicles challenges us to think about our own approach to worship, our own understanding of God's law, our own commitment to living lives that reflect his character.
It's a high calling, for sure, but also an inspiring one. It reminds us that we're not just living for ourselves, but for something much bigger than ourselves.
And that our lives, however small they may seem, can contribute to the unfolding of God's purposes in the world.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the historical context, the key themes, the literary techniques, the message of hope. But what does this all mean for us, for readers today? Why should we care about these ancient chronicles?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What's fascinating to me is that even though these books were written centuries ago, they still have something to teach us about faith, about leadership, about the human condition.
They remind us that history matters, that our choices have consequences, and that there's always hope, even in the midst of difficulty.
They invite us to think about our own place in that grand narrative of God's story, how we're shaping that story with our choices, what kind of legacy we're leaving for those who come after us. These are questions that resonate across the centuries.
It's like Chronicles is holding up a mirror to us, challenging us to examine our own lives, our own motivations, our own hopes.
It's a call to faithfulness, to integrity, to a life that reflects the character of God. It's a reminder that we're not just living for ourselves, but for something much bigger than ourselves.
You know, one of the things that strikes me about Chronicles is its emphasis on remembrance.
Yes.
The author is constantly reminding his readers of their past, of their history, of their identity as God's chosen people. Why is that so important?
Remembrance is crucial, especially for people in exile. They've lost their land, their temple, their political independence. Their very identity is under threat.
Yeah.
By recounting their history, the author is reaffirming their identity, reminding them of who they are, where they come from, and what they're called to be.
So remembrance is a way of grounding them, of giving them a sense of continuity and purpose in a time of upheaval and uncertainty.
Precisely. And it's not just about remembering the past for its own sake. It's about learning from the past, about drawing strength and wisdom from the experiences of those who have gone before.
It's about recognizing the patterns of faithfulness and unfaithfulness, of obedience and disobedience, and understanding how those patterns shape the course of history.
Exactly. And Chronicles reminds us that those patterns continue to play out in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own world.
It's a sobering thought, but also an empowering one. If we can learn from the past, if we can understand how our choices shape the future, then we have the power to break negative cycles, to create a better world for ourselves and for generations to come.
That's a powerful message of hope, wouldn't you say? A message that transcends the specific circumstances of that post-exilic community and speaks to us today in these profound ways.
Absolutely. What are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should kind of walk away with? What can these ancient texts teach us about faith, about leadership, about the human condition?
Well, for me, one of the most powerful messages of Chronicles is that enduring nature of hope. Even in the face of adversity. Remember, these books were written for a community struggling to rebuild their lives after exile. They lost their homeland, their temple, their political independence.
Yeah.
It would have been so easy to just succumb to despair, to give up on God, to lose sight of the future. But the author of Chronicles offers them a different perspective, a vision of hope rooted in God's faithfulness and his enduring promises.
It's not a passive hope either. It's a hope that calls for action, for faithfulness, for a commitment to rebuilding not just their physical lives, but their relationship with God.
Exactly. It's a hope that inspires them to rebuild the temple, to reestablish those covenant rituals, to restore their identity as God's chosen people. And it's a hope that ultimately points them toward a future where God's promises are fully realized, where the Davidic king returns, where justice reigns, and where God's presence dwells among his people.
I think that's such an important point. Chronicles isn't just about looking back at the past. It's about using the past to illuminate the present and to shape the future.
Absolutely.
It's about recognizing those patterns of faithfulness and unfaithfulness, of obedience and disobedience, and understanding how those patterns continue to play out in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own world.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to ask ourselves some hard questions. Are we living lives of faithfulness? Are we honoring the covenant? Are we contributing to the well-being of our communities, or are we part of the problem? It's a call to self-examination, to repentance, to a renewed commitment to living lives that are pleasing to God.
It's easy to get caught up in the details of the stories, the names, the dates, the battles, but I think it's important to step back and see that larger picture, that overarching narrative that the author is trying to convey. And that narrative, as we've discussed, is a narrative of hope, of redemption, of God's enduring love for his people.
Yes, and it's a narrative that continues to unfold today. We're all part of this larger story, this grand tapestry of human history. And our choices, our actions, our commitments all contribute to the direction of that story. Chronicles reminds us that we're not just living for ourselves. We're living for something much bigger than ourselves. We're part of a legacy that extends far beyond our own lifetimes.
And that legacy is ultimately shaped by our faithfulness to the covenant, to the values that God has revealed to us through his word and through the lives of those who've gone before us.
Exactly. It's about striving to live lives of integrity, of compassion, of justice, of love. It's about embodying the character of God in all that we do. And it's about trusting that even in the midst of darkness and uncertainty, God is still at work, weaving together the threads of our lives, our stories, our choices into this tapestry of beauty and redemption.
We've covered so much ground in this episode, and I want to thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise with us. It's been truly enlightening.
It's been a pleasure. I always enjoy diving into these ancient texts and kind of uncovering those hidden depths. And I hope our listeners have been inspired to do the same, to pick up a copy of 1 and 2 Chronicles and discover for themselves the richness and relevance of these often overlooked books.
That's a great note to end on. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into 1 and 2 Chronicles, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to By the Pages so you don't miss out on our future literary adventures. Until next time, keep exploring and keep those pages turning.